The aluminum spoon scraped against the bottom of the metal tray with a sound that could wake the dead. Captain Zara Kovalenko had been ladling out reconstituted beef stew for 3 hours straight, watching fresh-faced recruits shuffle past her station like cattle heading to slaughter. Their eyes held that peculiar blend of boredom and anticipation that only military chow lines could produce. None of them looked at her twice. Why would they? She was just another mess hall worker in faded fatigues, her once pristine flight wings now buried beneath layers of kitchen grease and forgotten dreams. The radio in the corner crackled to life, spitting static and garbled transmissions from the control tower. Routine traffic, weather updates, landing clearances for cargo planes bringing supplies from civilization. Zara had learned to tune it out months ago, the way a city dweller learns to ignore sirens and car horns. But then something cut through the white noise like a blade through silk. Ghost 77, requesting immediate clearance for emergency landing. Repeat, Ghost 77 inbound with critical payload. The ladle slipped from Zara's fingers, clattering onto the serving counter with a metallic ring that seemed to echo through her entire body. Ghost 77. That call sign had been dead and buried for 5 years, classified beyond the reach of freedom of information requests and journalists with too much curiosity. She knew because she had helped bury it. The recruit standing in front of her cleared his throat impatiently, pointing at his empty tray. "Ma'am, the stew." Zara's hand trembled as she reached for the ladle, her eyes never leaving the radio. The voice on the other end was requesting vectors to runway 27, using authentication codes that officially didn't exist. Codes that she had memorized in another life, when her call sign was Valkyrie Actual, and her Lockheed Martin F-35C Lightning II could slice through enemy airspace like a scalpel through skin. "Ma'am," the recruit's voice carried a note of concern now. "You okay?" She looked down at the brown slop she was serving and felt something cold settle in her stomach. 5 years ago, she had been the most decorated female pilot in her squadron, with 17 confirmed air-to-air kills and a chest full of medals that meant something. Now she was dishing out mystery meat to kids who probably couldn't even spell F-35, let alone fly one. The radio crackled again. "Tower, this is Ghost 77. I have wounded aboard and fuel for maybe 10 more minutes. Please advise." Zara's throat went dry. Whoever was flying Ghost 77 was using protocols from Operation Nightfall, a mission so classified that its existence had been scrubbed from every database she could access. A mission that had ended with her dishonorably discharged and lucky to avoid prison time. The mess hall around her faded into background noise as memories she had spent 5 years trying to forget came flooding back like water through a broken dam. The briefing room in Kandahar. The intelligence reports that didn't add up. The moment she realized she was being set up to take the fall for someone else's war crimes. She set down the ladle and walked toward the radio, each step feeling like she was walking toward her own execution. The static seemed to pulse with her heartbeat, and she could taste copper in her mouth. Behind her, confused voices rose as the chow line ground to a halt, but she didn't care. After 5 years of exile, her past had finally come looking for her. The emergency began with a whisper and a memory she thought was dead. Major Dmitry Volkov stood at the control tower's panoramic windows, his weathered hands gripping a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. 23 years of air traffic control had taught him to read the sky like a book, and today's chapter was written in storm clouds and uncertainty. The Ghost 77 transmission had set every nerve in his body on edge, not because it was unusual for aircraft to request emergency landing clearance, but because Ghost 77 was a call sign that existed only in classified files he wasn't supposed to know about. "Sir," Senior Airman Martinez looked up from her console, her young face creased with confusion. "I can't find Ghost 77 in any of our databases. No flight plan, no scheduled arrivals, nothing." Volkov nodded grimly. He had already checked 3 different systems and come up empty. In his experience, aircraft that didn't exist in official records usually carried cargo that didn't exist either. The kind of cargo that came with kill orders and burial details for anyone who asked too many questions. "Keep trying," he said, though he knew it was futile. "And Martinez, not a word about this to anyone until we know what we're dealing with." The radio squawked again, and this time the pilot's voice carried a note of desperation that made Volkov's skin crawl. "Tower, Ghost 77 requesting immediate medical assistance on the ground. I have a critically injured passenger who won't survive another delay." Volkov keyed his microphone. "Ghost 77, this is Tower Control. Please state your aircraft type and nature of your emergency." Silence stretched across the airwaves like a held breath. Then, "Tower, I'm flying a modified McDonnell Douglas FA-18E Super Hornet, tail number classified. My passenger is suffering from what appears to be nerve agent exposure. I need a hazmat team and your best trauma surgeon standing by." Martinez nearly knocked over her coffee. Nerve agent exposure meant chemical weapons, which meant this was no routine emergency. Volkov felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Every decision he made in the next few minutes could save lives or start a war. "Copy that, Ghost 77. You're cleared for emergency landing on runway 27. Medical and hazmat teams are being scrambled now." He paused, then added quietly, "And Ghost 77, welcome home." Down in the mess hall, Zara had reached the radio just as Volkov's transmission ended. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized his voice. Dmitry Volkov had been her air traffic controller during Operation Nightfall, the man who had guided her through the most dangerous airspace in Afghanistan, while enemy surface-to-air missiles painted her aircraft with targeting radar. She hadn't spoken to him in 5 years, not since the court-martial that had destroyed her career and scattered their unit to the 4 winds. The mess hall had emptied except for a handful of stragglers who were watching her with curiosity and concern. She ignored them, focusing on the voice coming through the radio static. The pilot of Ghost 77 sounded young, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of controlled panic that came from flying combat missions where one mistake meant death. "Tower, I'm on final approach now. Gear down, flaps extended. My passenger is unconscious and his vitals are deteriorating rapidly." Zara closed her eyes and let the familiar cadence of aviation communication wash over her like a prayer she had forgotten how to say. 5 years ago, she had been on the other side of these conversations, her voice calm and professional as she reported enemy positions and requested permission to engage. 5 years ago, she had been someone who mattered. The sound of jet engines screaming overhead snapped her back to the present. Through the mess hall windows, she could see a Super Hornet approaching runway 27, its landing lights cutting through the afternoon haze like twin stars. Even from this distance, she could tell the pilot was fighting to maintain control. The aircraft's approach was too steep, its speed too high for a normal landing. Something was very wrong. The Super Hornet touched down hard, its tires screaming against the asphalt as the pilot applied maximum braking. Black smoke poured from the landing gear as the aircraft decelerated, and Zara could see emergency vehicles racing toward the runway with their lights flashing and sirens wailing. In the distance, a convoy of military vehicles was approaching the base at high speed, their purpose unknown but their urgency unmistakable. Zara stood at the mess hall window and watched her past collide with her present in a shower of sparks and burning rubber. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than an emergency landing. It was bigger than a single injured passenger and a pilot flying an aircraft that shouldn't exist. It was the beginning of something that would change everything. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb stood in the base commander's office, his arms crossed, and his jaw set in an expression that could have been carved from granite. At 45, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had seen too much combat and made too many hard decisions. The silver star on his chest caught the afternoon light streaming through the blinds, casting small rainbows on the wall behind him like fragments of hope in a room that had precious little of it. "Sir, with all due respect, I don't like this," he said, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades in uniform. "Ghost aircraft, classified passengers, nerve agents. This has the smell of black operations, and black operations have a way of turning good soldiers into casualties." Brigadier General Patricia Hayes sat behind her desk, her fingers steepled and her expression unreadable. She had commanded this base for 3 years, turning it from a forgotten outpost into a vital link in the military's global logistics network. Her office walls were covered with commendations and photographs from deployments spanning 4 continents, but today she looked like a woman who had been handed a problem that defied easy solutions. "Marcus, I understand your concerns, but we don't have the luxury of choice here. That aircraft is on our runway, that passenger is in our medical facility, and those orders come from the Pentagon with classification levels that make my security clearance look like a library card." Webb moved to the window and watched the hazmat teams working around the Super Hornet. Even from this distance, he could see the careful, methodical way they were approaching the aircraft, their movements suggesting they were dealing with something far more dangerous than routine mechanical failure. "Have we identified the pilot yet?" Hayes shook her head. "He's in quarantine with the passenger until the medical team can determine the extent of contamination. But Marcus, there's something else you need to know. The authentication codes he used to request landing clearance are from Operation Nightfall." The name hit Webb like a physical blow. Operation Nightfall had been a joint CIA military operation 5 years ago, designed to eliminate a terrorist cell that had acquired chemical weapons in Afghanistan. The mission had gone sideways in spectacular fashion, ending with accusations of war crimes, a massive cover-up, and the court-martial of Captain Zara Kovalenko, one of the finest pilots he had ever served with. "That operation was classified beyond my clearance level," Webb said carefully. "But I know enough to understand that everyone connected to it ended up dead, discharged, or disappeared." Hayes nodded grimly. "Everyone except Captain Kovalenko, who is currently serving in our mess hall under disciplinary assignment. And before you ask, yes, I think that's connected to what's happening here." Webb felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. Zara Kovalenko had been his student when she was a lieutenant fresh out of flight school, hungry to prove herself in a man's world. He had watched her evolve from an eager young pilot into one of the most lethal air-to-air combatants in the squadron, her natural instincts sharpened by relentless training and an almost supernatural ability to read enemy movements before they happened. He had also watched her fall from grace, with the kind of spectacular finality that destroyed careers and lives with equal efficiency. "Sir, if Nightfall is connected to what's happening here, then we're dealing with something that goes far beyond emergency medical assistance. That operation involved chemical weapons, international arms dealers, and enough political dynamite to blow up half the Pentagon." Hayes stood and walked to her safe, extracting a manila folder thick with documents marked with security classifications that made Webb's eyes water. She set it on the desk between them like a loaded weapon. "Everything we know about Operation Nightfall is in this file, including the real reason Captain Kovalenko was court-martialed. Read it, Marcus. All of it. Because in about 6 hours, a team from the Defense Intelligence Agency is going to arrive here with questions that we need to be prepared to answer." Webb reached for the folder with the reluctance of a man touching a live electrical wire. He had spent most of his career following orders without question, trusting that someone higher up the chain of command had access to information that justified the risks and sacrifices demanded of soldiers like him. But Operation Nightfall had been different. Even from his limited perspective, he had sensed that something about the mission didn't add up. The intelligence reports had been inconsistent, the target identification questionable, and the aftermath suspiciously clean for an operation that had supposedly gone wrong. Now, 5 years later, he was about to learn the truth, and something told him he wasn't going to like what he found. The folder felt heavier than it should have as he opened it to the first page, where Captain Zara Kovalenko's service photograph stared back at him with eyes that still held the confidence and determination that had made her legendary among her peers. In 6 hours, the past would arrive with loaded questions and hidden agendas. In the medical facility, Dr. Rebecca Torres pulled off her contaminated gloves with the careful precision of someone who had spent 15 years treating casualties from chemical weapons attacks. The patient on the gurney before her was unconscious but stable, his vital signs slowly improving as the antidote worked its way through his bloodstream. She had seen nerve agent poisoning before, during her deployment to Syria, and this case followed the same brutal pattern of neurological shutdown and respiratory distress. What bothered her wasn't the medical presentation, it was the patient himself. According to his identification, the man was Dr. Jonathan Reeves, a biochemist from the Centers for Disease Control with security clearances that had triggered automatic notifications to Homeland Security, the FBI, and agencies whose acronyms she didn't recognize. But the scarring on his hands and forearms told a different story, the kind of surgical precision scars that came from combat injuries rather than laboratory accidents. Dr. Torres, nurse practitioner James Quinn, emerged from the quarantine airlock, his face pale beneath his protective mask. "The pilot is asking to speak with someone in command. He says it's urgent and related to national security." Torres nodded, still studying the unconscious patient's chart. Something about this entire situation felt wrong, like a puzzle with pieces that didn't belong to the same picture. A CDC biochemist poisoned by nerve agents, flying in a military aircraft that officially didn't exist, using authentication codes from a classified operation that had ended in scandal and cover-up. Has anyone identified the pilot yet? Quinn shook his head. He's refusing to give his name until he speaks with someone with appropriate security clearance. But Rebecca, there's something else. The blood tests came back on both of them, and the results don't make sense. Torres looked up from the chart, her attention fully focused. What do you mean? The nerve agent in their systems isn't VX or sarin or any of the standard chemical weapons we've been trained to treat. It's something I've never seen before, with a molecular structure that suggests it was engineered specifically to target certain genetic markers. The implications hit Torres like a cold wind. Genetic-specific chemical weapons were the stuff of science fiction and military nightmares, theoretical weapons that could target individuals or ethnic groups with surgical precision. The international community had banned research into such weapons decades ago, but that didn't mean someone hadn't continued development in secret. Are you saying this is some kind of bioweapon? Quinn nodded grimly. Not just any bioweapon. This stuff is designed to target people with specific DNA sequences, and according to the preliminary analysis, both the pilot and the passenger have genetic markers that suggest Eastern European ancestry. Torres felt her blood run cold. If Quinn was right, then they weren't dealing with a random terrorist attack or industrial accident. They were looking at the deployment of a weapon that could theoretically wipe out entire populations while leaving others completely unharmed. "I need to call this in to the CDC immediately," she said, reaching for the secure phone line that connected the medical facility to various government agencies. "And James, not a word of this to anyone until we know exactly what we're dealing with." But even as she dialed the number, Torres knew that their little base in the middle of nowhere had just become ground zero for something that could reshape the nature of warfare itself. Genetic-specific weapons didn't exist in a vacuum. They required massive resources, sophisticated laboratories, and the kind of political backing that came from the highest levels of government. Someone had spent years developing a weapon that could kill with surgical precision, and somehow that weapon had ended up in the bloodstream of two men who were now lying unconscious in her medical facility. Outside the quarantine ward, the pilot was beginning to regain consciousness, his vital signs slowly stabilizing as the antidote counteracted the nerve agent's effects. When he finally opened his eyes, the first words out of his mouth would change everything they thought they knew about Operation Nightfall, and the real reason Captain Zara Kovalenko had been sacrificed to protect a secret that someone was willing to kill to keep hidden. The evening shift change at 1800 hours usually brought a sense of relief to the base, but tonight the air hummed with tension that had nothing to do with the approaching storm clouds on the horizon. Sergeant First Class Malik Washington had been pulling security duty for 8 years, long enough to recognize when a routine day had transformed into something that would be classified and buried in files that didn't officially exist. The convoy that had arrived 2 hours ago consisted of 6 black SUVs with tinted windows and license plates that traced back to shell companies in Virginia. The men and women who emerged wore civilian clothes, but moved with the kind of coordinated precision that screamed military or intelligence background. They had set up a command post in Building C and immediately began sweeping the area with equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. Washington adjusted his position at the main gate and keyed his radio. "Command, this is gate security. I've got more vehicles approaching from the east. 3 more SUVs, same profile as the earlier arrivals." Lieutenant Colonel Webb's voice crackled back through the static. "Copy that, Washington. Let them through but log everything. License plates, number of occupants, time of arrival. And Sergeant, keep your eyes open and your mouth shut." The SUVs rolled through the gate with the kind of silent authority that made Washington's skin crawl. In the back seat of the lead vehicle, he caught a glimpse of a woman in her 50s with silver hair and eyes that looked like they had seen too many secrets. She stared directly at him as the convoy passed, and for a moment he felt like a butterfly being examined by an entomologist who was deciding whether to add it to her collection or pin it to a board. Inside Building C, Agent Patricia Morrison of the Defense Intelligence Agency was setting up what would become the nerve center of an investigation that would ultimately reach into the highest levels of the Pentagon and the CIA. Morrison had spent 12 years tracking down loose ends from black operations that had gone wrong, and Operation Nightfall represented one of the loosest ends in her files. "Agent Harrison, I want a full workup on everyone who had access to Nightfall intelligence. Scientists, pilots, support staff, janitors, everyone." She paused at a bank of monitors displaying satellite feeds from around the base. "And get me everything we have on Captain Zara Kovalenko's activities for the past 5 years." Agent Harrison, a thin man in his 30s who looked like he had never seen direct sunlight, nodded and began typing on a laptop that was connected to databases most government employees didn't know existed. "Ma'am, we already have surveillance footage of her approaching the radio in the mess hall when Ghost 77 made his emergency call. Her biometric readings suggest extreme stress response, elevated heart rate, perspiration, dilated pupils." Morrison studied the grainy footage on the monitor, watching as Zara moved toward the radio with the kind of purposeful intent that suggested recognition rather than curiosity. In Morrison's experience, people didn't react that strongly to random radio chatter unless it meant something deeply personal to them. "What about the pilot? Any progress on identification?" Harrison pulled up another file. "Still unconscious, but we've run his fingerprints through every database we have access to. No matches in military records, no matches in federal databases, no matches anywhere. It's like he doesn't exist." Morrison had seen this before, deep cover operatives whose identities had been so thoroughly scrubbed that they existed only in files buried beneath layers of classification. The problem with ghost soldiers was that they tended to reappear at the worst possible moments, carrying information that could destroy careers and topple governments. Keep trying. And Agent Harrison, prep the interrogation room. I have a feeling that when our mystery pilot wakes up, he's going to have some very interesting things to tell us. 3 miles away, in the base's communications center, Technical Sergeant Linda Rodriguez was conducting her own investigation into the Ghost 77 transmission. As the base's senior communications specialist, she had access to equipment that could analyze radio signals with the kind of precision that bordered on the supernatural. The authentication codes used by the Ghost 77 pilot had been genuine. That much was certain. But what worried Rodriguez was the encryption signature embedded in the transmission. It matched protocols from Operation Nightfall, but with modifications that suggested someone had been updating and refining the codes over the past 5 years. Someone who still had access to information that was supposed to be buried and forgotten. Rodriguez pulled up the original Nightfall communication protocols and began comparing them to the Ghost 77 transmission. The similarities were too numerous to be coincidental, but the differences suggested evolution rather than simple replication. Someone had been maintaining and improving these codes, which meant Operation Nightfall hadn't ended 5 years ago. It had simply gone deeper underground. She picked up her secure phone and dialed Agent Morrison's direct line. "Ma'am, it's Rodriguez in communications. I think you need to see this." In the medical facility, Dr. Jonathan Reeves was beginning to stir, his consciousness surfacing from the chemical fog that had nearly killed him. The first coherent thought that formed in his mind was a name, Captain Zara Kovalenko. The second was a number, 72 hours. The pilot lying in the bed next to him was already awake, his eyes tracking the movements of the medical staff with the kind of alertness that came from years of survival training. When their eyes met, the pilot gave an almost imperceptible nod, and Reeves knew that phase 1 of their mission was complete. They had made it to the base. Now the real work could begin. But first, they needed to make contact with the one person who could help them, prevent a catastrophe that would make Operation Nightfall look like a training exercise. The storm that had been building on the horizon all day finally broke at 2100 hours, sending sheets of rain across the base like nature's own version of electronic countermeasures. Lightning illuminated the concrete buildings in stark black and white, and thunder rolled across the landscape with the kind of deep, rumbling authority that reminded everyone of their insignificance in the face of forces beyond human control. In the interrogation room in Building C, Agent Morrison sat across from the pilot who had identified himself only as Phoenix. The name was obviously a call sign rather than a legal identity, but Morrison had learned to be patient with operatives who had spent years living in the shadows. Trust was a luxury that people like Phoenix couldn't afford, and information was a currency that had to be exchanged carefully to avoid fatal consequences. "Let's start with something simple," Morrison said, her voice carrying the kind of professional neutrality that came from years of extracting secrets from people who had been trained to resist interrogation. "Tell me about Dr. Reeves." Phoenix shifted in his chair, his hands resting on the metal table between them. Even in the sterile fluorescent lighting of the interrogation room, he looked like someone who had been forged in combat rather than classroom. His face carried the kind of weathered intensity that came from making life-and-death decisions under fire, and his eyes held depths that suggested he had seen things that would give normal people nightmares. "Dr. Reeves is exactly who his identification says he is. A biochemist from the CDC with expertise in genetic-specific biological weapons. What his official file doesn't mention is that he's been working undercover for the past 3 years, tracking down the people responsible for developing the weapon that nearly killed us both." Morrison leaned forward slightly, her interest sharpening. "And who exactly are the people responsible?" Phoenix was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting to the one-way mirror that dominated the wall behind Morrison. He knew they were being watched and recorded, and that every word he spoke would be analyzed by teams of experts looking for inconsistencies and deceptions. The same people who set up Captain Zara Kovalenko to take the fall for Operation Nightfall, he said finally. The same people who have been developing genetic-specific weapons in violation of every international treaty on biological warfare. The same people who are planning to deploy those weapons in 48 hours unless we stop them. The words hit Morrison like physical blows. Genetic-specific weapons were theoretical nightmares that existed only in classified research papers and the fevered imaginations of military strategists. The idea that someone had actually developed such weapons and was planning to use them represented a threat that could destabilize the entire global order. Who are these people? Phoenix smiled, but there was no humor in it. You already know who they are, Agent Morrison. You've been tracking them for years without realizing it. Every black operation that went wrong, every classified project that disappeared without explanation, every good soldier who got burned to protect state secrets. They were all connected to the same shadow network that's been operating inside our own government for the past decade. Morrison felt her blood run cold. In her 12 years with the DIA, she had uncovered enough evidence of corruption and conspiracy to fill a small library, but she had always assumed these were isolated incidents rather than pieces of a larger puzzle. The possibility that there was an actual shadow network operating within the intelligence community was the kind of paranoid fantasy that destroyed careers and landed investigators in psychiatric hospitals. That's a serious accusation. Phoenix nodded. Serious enough that Dr. Reeves and I have spent 3 years gathering evidence while living under assumed identities and dodging assassination attempts. Serious enough that we're willing to risk everything to get that evidence to someone who can act on it. And that someone is Captain Kovalenko. Phoenix leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since the interrogation began, he looked genuinely surprised. You really don't know, do you? You think Zara was a scapegoat, a convenient target who got burned to protect someone else's operation. Morrison nodded. That had been her working theory for 5 years, supported by inconsistencies in the official reports and testimony that never quite added up. Captain Kovalenko had been portrayed as a rogue pilot who had acted outside orders and caused civilian casualties, but the evidence had always felt manufactured rather than authentic. She wasn't a scapegoat, Phoenix said quietly. She was the only one who figured out what was really happening during Operation Nightfall. The only one who realized that the mission wasn't about stopping terrorists from acquiring chemical weapons. It was about field testing those weapons on civilian populations to gather data for future deployment. The room seemed to grow colder as the implications of Phoenix's words sank in. If he was telling the truth, then Operation Nightfall hadn't been a counterterrorism mission that went wrong. It had been a deliberate war crime disguised as a rescue operation. The court-martial wasn't punishment for disobeying orders, Phoenix continued. It was a way to silence the only witness who could expose the real purpose of the mission. And now, 5 years later, that same shadow network is ready to deploy their genetic-specific weapons on a scale that will make Nightfall look like a training exercise. Outside, lightning illuminated the base in stark relief, and Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was just beginning. In the medical facility, Dr. Rebecca Torres was reviewing blood work that defied everything she thought she knew about biochemical warfare. The genetic-specific nerve agent in Phoenix and Dr. Reeves' systems was unlike anything in the literature, with a molecular structure that suggested years of sophisticated research and development. What troubled her most was the precision of its targeting. The weapon was designed to attack specific genetic sequences found almost exclusively in people of Eastern European descent. Dr. Torres, Nurse Quinn appeared in the doorway of her office, his face pale and drawn. You need to see this. Dr. Reeves is awake and he's asking for Captain Kovalenko by name. Torres followed Quinn through the sterile corridors of the medical facility, her mind racing through the implications of a CDC biochemist who somehow knew about a disgraced pilot serving disciplinary duty in their mess hall. The connections were too numerous and too specific to be coincidental, which meant they were dealing with something far more complex than a simple emergency medical situation. Dr. Reeves was sitting up in his hospital bed when they entered his room, his eyes clear and alert despite the trauma his body had endured. He looked like a man who had been carrying terrible knowledge for too long and was finally ready to share the burden with someone else. "Dr. Torres, I need you to understand something," he said without preamble. "What happened to Phoenix and me wasn't an accident. We were deliberately exposed to that nerve agent because someone discovered we were getting close to the truth about Operation Nightfall and its connection to an ongoing biological weapons program." Torres pulled up a chair next to his bed, her medical training warring with her curiosity about the larger story unfolding around them. "Dr. Reeves, you've been through a serious trauma. You should focus on recovering before." "There isn't time for recovery," Reeves interrupted. "In less than 48 hours, someone is going to deploy genetic-specific biological weapons against civilian populations in 3 different countries. The death toll could reach into the millions, and the genetic targeting will make it look like a natural epidemic rather than an act of war." The words hit Torres like a physical blow. Genetic-specific weapons that could masquerade as natural epidemics represented the ultimate nightmare scenario for public health officials, mass casualty events that would be nearly impossible to trace back to their human creators. "How do you know this?" Reeves reached under his pillow and pulled out a device that looked like a modified smartphone, its screen displaying data streams that Torres didn't recognize. "Because I've been tracking the development of these weapons for 3 years, ever since I discovered that CDC resources were being diverted to support research that violated every biological weapons treaty in existence." He touched the screen, and a map appeared showing 3 locations highlighted in red: Prague, Sarajevo, and Kiev. Each city was marked with population density data and genetic analysis charts that made Torres' blood run cold. "The targeting is surgical," Reeves continued. "The weapons are designed to attack people with specific genetic markers while leaving others completely unharmed. To outside observers, it will look like 3 separate outbreaks of a virulent but naturally occurring pathogen." Torres stared at the map, trying to process the magnitude of what Reeves was describing. Biological weapons that could target specific ethnic groups while leaving others unharmed would fundamentally alter the nature of warfare and genocide, turning weapons of mass destruction into instruments of surgical precision. "Why are you telling me this? I'm a military doctor, not an intelligence operative." Reeves smiled grimly. "Because you're treating the only 2 people who have physical evidence of these weapons, and because this base is home to the only person who has the skills and knowledge necessary to stop what's coming." "Captain Kovalenko." Reeves nodded. "During Operation Nightfall, Zara stumbled onto the early stages of this weapons program. She tried to report what she had discovered through official channels, but instead of being investigated, her concerns were buried, and she was court-martialed to ensure her silence. What the people who destroyed her career didn't realize is that she gathered evidence before her downfall, evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy." Torres felt pieces of a massive puzzle clicking into place. The mysterious radio transmission, the classified authentication codes, the genetic-specific nerve agent, and the disgraced pilot serving disciplinary duty in their mess hall. It was all connected by a thread of conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. "Where is this evidence?" Reeves's smile became genuine for the first time since he had regained consciousness. "Hidden in the one place no one would think to look, embedded in the maintenance logs of her old F-35C Lightning II, which is currently sitting in a boneyard in Arizona, officially listed as decommissioned but actually maintained in ready status by a shadow unit that doesn't appear on any organizational chart. Outside, the storm was intensifying, and tours couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing against more than just weather. Time was running out, and the fate of millions hung in the balance. The storm reached its peak intensity at 200 hours, turning the base into an island of artificial light surrounded by a sea of wind-driven rain and electrical fury. In Building C, Agent Morrison was studying files that painted a picture of conspiracy and corruption that reached far deeper than she had ever imagined possible. The evidence that Phoenix and Dr. Reeves had provided was compelling, but it was also terrifying in its implications for the stability of the intelligence community and the government it served. "Agent Harrison," she called across the command center, "I need you to run a trace on every personnel transfer, reassignment, and retirement that occurred in the 6 months following Operation Nightfall. Cross-reference that data with current assignment locations and security clearances." Harrison's fingers flew across his keyboard with the kind of intense focus that came from hunting patterns in massive databases. "Ma'am, I'm seeing some interesting correlations. 17 personnel from the Nightfall operation were transferred to positions in biological research facilities, pharmaceutical companies, and CDC field offices. All of them received significant salary increases and enhanced security clearances." Morrison felt her suspicions crystallizing into certainty. Personnel transfers following controversial operations were routine, but the pattern Harrison was describing suggested something far more deliberate than random reassignment. Someone had been systematically placing Nightfall veterans in positions where they could support ongoing biological weapons research. What about Captain Kovalenko? Any unusual activity in her service record before the court-martial? Harrison pulled up another file, his expression growing increasingly grim as he read. "Ma'am, this is strange. 3 weeks before her court-martial, Captain Kovalenko filed a formal request to inspect the maintenance records of her aircraft. The request was denied, but she accessed the files anyway using her pilot's override codes." Morrison leaned forward, her interest sharpening. Aircraft maintenance records were mundane documents that most pilots never bothered to examine unless there was a specific mechanical problem. The fact that Kovalenko had been interested enough to violate protocol suggested she had been looking for something specific. What was she looking for? Harrison continued scrolling through the files. "Unknown, ma'am, but I'm showing that she downloaded approximately 50 gigabytes of data from her aircraft's computer systems in the 48 hours before her arrest. The data